Good evening, everyone. This is Rillian for the 2_NK group. This content will be rebroadcast from my own personal channel, Rillian2_MK, to our main 2_MK channel with my full permission. Today we're looking at the NashBot that we've been making, and we're going to review the specific goals of it, what you can use it for, what it's not useful for, and some comparisons as to why it took us so long to make a bot for a character that is relatively common and does not have a DLC block keeping most people from playing him. I won't be fighting anyone today as usual for this guidance, just the bot. However, I will use more than one character as I go. So as usual, our bot settings need to be specifically set. My own character will have everything set to normal. The bot will have maximum start on both a V gauge and critical gauge, but will not actually rebuild them over time naturally. So, the first action and the core reason why the bot exists in the form it does is intended to force you to deal with dash pressure and learn how to punish certain things. I'll turn on the inputs a little bit later, but this one is basically just a crouching medium kick, a crouching medium kick with a very rapid punch that follows it, an equally rapid dash that follows that, then a standing medium punch, and a quarter circle back motion to end it. This results in our usual edge shifted style of play. The bot is able to do EX Sonic Scythe or medium kick Sonic Scythe, depending on whether or not it has neither. The dash is the thing that is intended to happen less often. You're gonna expect to see this most of the time, but he does have it and he will use it at particular spaces and timings. That medium kick is really important, but you can't necessarily do much about it, so we also didn't make that something that spends a lot of time being done. Fortunately, Nash does have a gap in his moves where he basically doesn't have a down to back and punch motion for anything. Down forward and kick, however, will do something, so you're going to see that medium kick a lot less than you'd expect. The next thing is a relatively simple input. Mine has an extra jab on the end of it, but the actually intended input is simply to whiff a throw and very quickly put in yet another dash and his forward heavy punch. As you can see, once again, because the inputs are so quick, if left alone, he will mostly just do one thing over and over. But change that timing and he'll do something different. He's a very rhythmic bot, and a lot of the things that he does are therefore capable of being very random. Recording slot 3 is relatively easy. It's just his overhead, but is done with 2 punches such that after the back dash that follows it, which also hides a V skill. The V skill input is there for 2 reasons. One, to have him do it as rarely as possible, but you know, occasionally surprise you with it. And secondarily, to act as the second punch input for the EX Sonic Boom. So he is actually throwing the second boom, but only in the EX version, and you won't actually see it here. So he back dashes usually before booms and stays out of the range of you, and generally otherwise at normal for Nash. The down to forward or quarter circle forward motion at the end of that is what allows him to do the boom, and there are various other inputs with light punch, medium punch, and heavy punch at different timings to vary which boom he does. However, he doesn't do booms that often, and this is intentional, and I'll get to the exact reasons why later. This particular input is a little bit different than most things. He is supposed to do the bullet knee like that, but we've also hidden a couple target combo style inputs, which actually turn out to be really easy and also useful for getting his back rolls in here for when you knock him down. He can be very mashy about the back roll. And at the end it has a little hop, not necessarily to actually do anything with. It acts more as a weird sort of anti-air because you can't just jump on him when he does certain things. Also, when he corners you, if your instinct is to jump away from him, he might catch you. And finally, this is the simplest input. This is the one that is, we'll call it spare parts. The only purpose of this input is to enter a tragedy assault. On its own, it does the heavy punch one because it's looping back into the crouching heavy punch that he was given at the beginning. But the input itself is just a crouching heavy punch, a forward jump, and a Shoryuken style motion in the air at the timing at which you would do a very high jumping attack. You may have to tweak this, but fortunately it's a really simple input. It's also the one you're most likely to be able to remove from the bot entirely. The bot does not really require this to have the correct rhythm. All this will really do is cause it to randomly tragedy assault or jump at timings which you would then have to anti-air. So, let's start putting these together and explain the second layer of what the bot is intended to do. So I'm going to turn on just 1 and 2. Fortunately, this is a relatively boring style of Nash interaction. It's mostly here just to help you get used to having to deal with him throwing you. The rhythm can change, and he'll dash more and he'll throw more, but it's really not that complicated as a character. It's just changing his rhythm and seeing different things happen because the rhythm changed. And since the quarter circle back that's in recording slot 1 ends up interacting with a throw, it can, under certain very strange circumstances, do a light kick sonic scythe, but it normally doesn't do anything in particular. For similar reasons, if I turn on action 3 with 1, you're more likely to see nothing at all, as mentioned. The quarter circle back motion at the end of action 1 doesn't really do anything when it interacts with 3. 3 into itself will eventually throw booms, but 1 into 3 and so on, they don't really do anything. This is to keep the bot clean and prevent there from being too much that it has to do, but it's also because we needed as much variation in the booms as possible. So action 1 doesn't do a lot when it goes into those. Similarly here, you have the light kick scythe. But he's not going to spend a lot of time doing that either. It's just to get you used to him having it as an option. And finally, of course, I don't even have to show this one. This doesn't do anything because, again, quarter circle back into heavy punch doesn't do anything. So action 1 will mostly repeat into itself, and then it goes into 5 and it just does a crouching heavy punch. The reason this bot is intended to be so clean and simple is because of the purpose of the bot. So I'm going to turn on actions 2 and 3 and start getting into what the purpose of the bot is. The purpose of the bot is unlike more other bots where there's a specific goal. We felt it was useful to make a bot that does a good job of keeping you on toes with your punishes, with your meter awareness, just general play style and timing, without putting too much overall stress on the player. Basically, the one thing we were lacking is a bot to just use to warm up when you're online. And anyone can use this, unlike the other bots where they lose their usefulness as you gain skill, as you go up in rank and so on. This bot, if the only thing you intend to do with it is use it to keep yourself on your toes, practice your combos as punishes, practice your reactions and anti-airs and so on, you can turn on different amounts of this bot to see what you get. And generally use it to warm up between matches at nearly any level, given you're just trying to make sure that your inputs are correct. And he has a predictable amount of plus and minus frames on most of the things he does. So the player is able to tell, based on the interaction they have with the bot, how off they are on any given day, and if they should just not necessarily play the game that day, or spend more time with the bot, you know, getting the fingers warmed up and so on. But despite that, it does have a specific purpose and goal relative to players who are not that familiar with certain parts of this matchup. And I'll demonstrate why that needed to happen in a little bit. As you can see, 3 and 4 is just mostly an interaction of this type. Something akin to pressure, and a few random buttons thrown out to basically just give you trouble and make you think about hitting buttons yourself in different timing. Whereas 3 and 5, as noted, doesn't do too much, but this will be the one that allows you to get the heavy sonic boom. It's just going to be rare because he's generally in motion, and being in motion allows for a lot of specific flows. If your timing is off in any way, it will be different, but overall, this just works out. And as you can see, as 3 and 5 interact with each other, you get different levels of the tragedy assault, and so on. So you can never be quite sure what will come out. Just as with a player, you have to watch your meter, you have to be aware of what's going on. But actually, rather than show off the bot now, I'll go into some explanation of why it is we built the bot this way, rather than focusing on a lot of specific things that Nash can do. There are a lot of things you'll notice immediately if you're familiar with our bots that they're missing. If you are a beginner who is working through bots and matchups this way, you recognize, well, this isn't really going to do a lot of the things that I have trouble with in this matchup. And the reason for that is, as mentioned, our last few bots, we didn't end up making them because of precisely this reason. If you give the computer, the AI, the CPU, if you give it the same parameters and options, you'll know that it's not necessarily that different, but it's much more likely to kill you. And as with most bots, it won't do anything really easily understandable to someone who has never fought Nash seriously before. Without that predictability, given that he is an unpredictable character to begin with, you're either stuck with a perfect understanding of what the CPU can do, but not so much what a player will do, or you're stuck with something you actually can't deal with because you don't have enough experience yet, for whatever reason. But as you can see, if you wanted to, for example, spend a lot of time dealing with this, he'll use this basically every time he gets near. And he'll do the whole, oh, look, you are trying to punish me after that, but I'm plus. You don't need our bot to help you practice dealing with moonsault, dealing with spacings from sonic booms thrown often, as demonstrated, dealing with specific dash spacings and jump backs. But you'll know what he doesn't do. He doesn't do a lot of throwing. In fact, it's really almost weird. The AI is, even at level 8, going to spend most of its time throwing booms. And we all have heard the horror stories lately with Manat. You just can't always count on the in-game AI to give you either a true challenge or a true understanding of what you're facing in an opponent character. So you see you have a lot of stuff here going on that you can't necessarily make decisions based on. Furthermore, as mentioned before, those of you who are aware or who have tried particular things will know that the CPU basically cheats. It can read your inputs, it can use that knowledge to avoid things altogether, and it can basically make you feel as if some of your mix-ups and so on aren't valid, or even certain reactions that would make more sense because no player would ever hit the button. The player would not take the risk. To the CPU, it's not a risk because it knows that it will absolutely hit you. So, if you want to learn to deal with Nash's jump-ins, especially his jumping heavy kick, if you want to learn to deal with Nash's buttons and booms in neutral, and if you want to learn to deal with Nash's moonsault pressure, the CPU will do a very good job of making sure that you have all of those experiences. So, stuff like that. I've learned I can do that by fighting the CPU alone. You can trust it to do a very good job for you of teaching you what is and is not possible. As long as you give it the same settings, the maximum start, everything will work out fine mostly. But it also doesn't punish you particularly well, you'll notice. Or maybe that's not very noticeable, but I can tell you from experience that I can do a lot of silly things versus the CPU Nash, specifically. And he'll just let me get away with most of it. So if you don't know your own frame data on your character, this bot, the bot is much better because the bot does a lot more things. Nash is an interesting character in that you don't really want Nash to actually have a lot of defense or a lot of time spent doing nothing, because you don't get punished properly. He has enough fast moves that aren't super unsafe of their own accord that you don't really need to worry about him doing stuff that doesn't work correctly. He's just okay as he is. So here we go. Boom pressure, eventually he'll moonsault. You can learn to deal with those main three things. Unfortunately, you can't necessarily gain much experience in anything else, especially at level 8 where he confirms nearly everything. So for those of us who don't have the time to be dealing with this as a way of learning a matchup, that is the purpose for which our bot was created. You can treat the CPU Nash as a bot in itself with the same settings, and you'll probably make it available what point system you use in the case of that, or we'll make sure that people understand how to go about thinking about it so that they know what to look for in terms of their own character. But he is definitely lacking a lot of the things that you generally need, and he has far too much ability to predict what you are going to do To the point where if I go near him and crouch for long enough, I'll just end up stand blocking after a little bit because I know that he'll try to do particular things. But no, again, there's really no benefit to this in the long term because you haven't gained enough information about how players are likely to play Nash, or the strange and crazy things Nash can do with buttons that leave him negative just because you block something and your opponent doesn't know whether or not to finish it. The CPU doesn't even start the sort of combos we're talking about because it recognizes it's not going to hit you. Based on your inputs, it knows whether or not it's going to hit you and it just doesn't do the move. You can make that work a little bit better by obviously lowering the CPU level, but it becomes inconsistent after a little bit. So if you want to learn your tricks against Nash's main tools, we strongly suggest just using this instead. But that's not what we're here to do today. We are here to look at NashBot and the way it reacts to things. So, having said that done, so now you can see that the bot does a lot of things it shouldn't probably do in order to win, but it's a lot closer to the sort of things players have to do in order to play Nash when the opponent has like a way to prevent themselves from being caught in boom loops or just general forward movement. So now, onto the point system and the autopilot concept that brought us here. The point system for this bot is based around learning the Nash matchup quickly, and then just getting used to the idea that you can do certain things at certain ranges to punish him or deal with situations, and things you cannot deal with. Fortunately, he does those things less than other things, and it forces you to keep your mind locked onto particular things while still trying to punish everything else. At least that is what you should be doing. So, obviously, you can guess that none of the point systems that will be mentioned are going to have anything to do with the quote-unquote point systems that you would get if you were fighting the CPU, as if they were a bot. Here you're looking for something entirely other. Nash has to do his overhead to open most people up. For those of you who are not too familiar, this is because his moonsault is not actually something that needs to be blocked standing. You can just block moonsault crouching. For some people this is better, but the move is also plus, so technically you shouldn't be blocking at all. Still, it's not information that you need to understand, other than to know that you can crouch block against Nash a lot more than would be obvious if you think of aerial moves as things you must stand block. And therefore, Nash must do that to open you up. Now, once Nash does that and you do block it, you should be able to punish it. It is not actually a plus move. Obviously, most overheads are at least -6, and Nash's is no exception. The few that are not are usually dealt with in their own character. But what does -6 let you do? Well, Nash's, like Rashid's, takes him relatively far forward for an overhead, so he doesn't have to be standing that close to you to do this. It's also not necessarily faster than other overheads, but it's kind of ambiguous in when it's actually happening versus something else. And as you can see, we also made sure that the bot just doesn't do it that often without being interrupted or otherwise pressed on. So you could just block all day, but chip damage eventually becomes a thing. And for this reason, it is one of the easiest ways to get points. We were considering making it a harder way, but it doesn't really compare to some of the other things that he's supposed to do. So, the other things you're supposed to deal with are his medium kick scythe, which is also rare. Light kick one doesn't give you points, but you should also be on the lookout for it. But not the tragedy assault, because the tragedy assault is easy to deal with for the most part. So the EX one and the medium one are both things you should be attempting to punish with combos. And you should try to get as full a combo as you can, obviously. The difficulty goes up the other way. If you have meter, you should try to use the meter, and so on. But you'll notice that after a while that part starts to get mentally taxing. But you are dropping damage if you can't or don't do it. There's also a lot of things where Nash's spacing matters and you have to learn the spacing. That, for example, that move is, for most people, unpunishable. He comes forward so far, and the way he goes backward means that basically nothing happens to him. You can also look into some of his other moves and see what, if anything, your character can do about them, but please note that he has a strong tendency to have moves that push back their boxes in such a way that you figure it's time to hit a button, and you just can't. It makes him a slightly gimmicky character in that you spend a lot of time losing to Nash because you think it's your turn and the Nash player just hits another button and whiff punishes whatever you stuck out to punish him. But the bot is intended to teach you exactly not to do that, whereas the CPU doesn't do a very good job of this generally. So I'm supposed to punish that. I'm not supposed to punish that. Booms are irrelevant. And I'm supposed to not get hit when he does that. Not necessarily punish it, although punishing it still counts as a point, obviously, because he didn't get hit. And sometimes he actually doesn't do it with an attack in the first place, so it doesn't even matter. But you're aiming to learn that much about him. Spacings and other things you get to mess with. He's not very good for practicing your meaties. You should use Lara for that. Or Jury, depending on if you've bought Jury. And he's not very good for learning a whole lot about the matchup as a whole because he's a zoner, and the zoner type player has a good idea of how they want to play relative to adapting to you, rather than the other way around. It's precisely for this reason that you have to spend so much time capitalizing on minor advantages like him actually doing that, or recognizing that you should tech a throw from him. We're currently considering that one of the main things you should be able to do is tech throws, but where exactly in the flow that should be and whether or not it should actually even be a point, difficult to say. So you end up learning your character's ranges because I can poke him out of that with medium punch. And I can punish a ton of stuff like this. Most people cannot do this. The whole 5-frame move with extremely long setup. But I assure you that that move, at least in the bot if input correctly, he should be blocking, even if not necessarily for very long. But as you can see, it came up on my screen as reversal, so really I'm literally doing that as early as possible. So he can't actually block. And you may have a move like that, but if you see if a use a much slower move, he can entirely get out of the way, it doesn't even matter. That move, if he does it on wake up, the punish is usually different than if he does it in neutral because of the distances. There are other things you can do, such as hitting him in between particular hits of it, and things you learn by poking around at him. We were also considering making you punish his sweep, but that's not as relevant as his knee bullet. His knee bullet, which he is very seldom using, because again, of rhythm and a couple other reasons. And you have to be ready to look for it. That move right there, that move is actually -5. And while Nash can make it hit from quite far, and somewhat help that, you should still be prepared to at least try to punish it with a 3-frame move, because he ends up rather close. Also, if you attempt to air him, he has a lot of good buttons that beat ordinary air-to-airs. And this is a Nash thing as a general thing. So you should generally learn to do this based on the bot's ability. He jumps often enough that you could also use anti-airs as a bot point, but you can guess it would be one of the ones that quickly stops being relevant in terms of actually getting points that matter. But what exactly is it that Nash lets you do in terms of autopilot? Well, this bot is very similar to Birdie, but does a better job of actually forcing you to focus your autopilot. If you recognize that you keep on losing to the bot in some way, or not keeping track of the points that you're getting, because you should be able to split your focus at least that much. That's the part of you that is needed to make strategic decisions while the rest of you is focused on doing things like this. So my goal at the moment is to think as little as possible about what I'm doing here without going into full offense mode. And yet manage to get points on the bot and not try to punish things that I shouldn't punish. If my autopilot is bad or I have particular bad habits, the specific way that NashBot plays and moves will tend to expose those fairly quickly. Execution errors you often make, and similar things. So you can just use this bot to grind combos. Even if that's all you want to do in a particular day, you just want to work out some combos, you have to be able to target your combos. And he does enough moves that are punishable but slightly far out that you can recognize and get to learn stuff about your combos, like, can I do this combo under this amount of pressure? Can I do this combo and recognize that my opponent wasn't as close as I thought they were and therefore needed to do something different? All of those things are super important, especially against characters who actually have invincible moves and can trip you up by being slightly out of range and messing with you. If you understand certain aspects of spacing in this game, you can lure your opponent into a lot of danger. And NashBot is no exception to that. For example, I have the bad habit of doing the air lags into the crouching light punch, which doesn't actually even really have a reason. There's no particular reason why I do that, because I basically assumed that air lags was going to get nerfed at the end of Season 1, so I never spent a lot of time building it into my style. I am sad to have been right, but the reason that I do air lags into light punch is just bad habits as an overall thing. There's no reason to do that, and there's no specific reason why I've built up that muscle memory. I just do it. And I need to fix it, and here is the place to fix it. I can also check if my autopilot has become too based on specific combos. You can use it to like watch from your own mental backyard to figure out whether or not you have done something to your fighting style lately that doesn't make any sense and you need to fix it. Because I am here doing auto combos. I assure you that I'm here doing auto combos. Auto setups, evasions. But every now and again he does something that makes me have to pause because I have to think about, wait, am I supposed to do which combo goes here again? And in that moment, an opponent has advantage on you because they know what comes next. They even know what to expect you to try to do next. So they are winning in that moment. Air-to-air interactions are also a strong thing you can use the bot to study, and you can do that while getting points otherwise. As mentioned, the anti-air points for this bot are probably going to be air-to-air points, rather than just doing your regular move, because you have two other bots, presumably, to deal with that. Which brings us to obviously the last aspect of the bot. This is the bot you use to learn a new character, or to practice a character you haven't fought in a while. Advanced players can use it for one more thing as well, which is basically their equivalent of the same situation. Advanced players, especially those who go to tournaments or play in battle lounges a lot, even the smaller battle lounges, if they realize that the opponent has chosen a character against whom their main character is not that good, and they want to shift who they are playing, they have to be able to swap often an entire set of muscle memory, because it is generally unlikely in Street Fighter V for your main and your secondary to fight in similar ways, and that you then also need to switch. So now this is hard. This is hard because everything that Colleen does is separate and different from what Chun-Li does, except possibly that, and I still have to hit up a different button for that. So the ability to adapt really quickly to using the character you need to use to get an advantage needs to be built up. It's a skill that needs to be learned. It also works for learning new characters altogether. But you're still aiming to autopilot. You're still checking how good is my autopilot, because if your opponent is beating you in a particular way, there's a good chance that your mind is on how do I deal with this, how do I beat them, and so on, and not so much the match in front of you for the first few seconds. You might have decided, I'm going to do this plan, that's why I'm changing to this character, but then they counter your plan because they know that the character is a counter pick. So now what? You can sit there quietly and give them a chance to do things, but as soon as they get the life lead, this can become a problem. So what do? You try to make sure that you can do this as quickly as possible. Adapt around your opponent as quickly as possible. change your own ability, make sure all your own punishes are on point and ready. The pros make it look really easy, but for most people, the final result is actually that they just end up playing their secondary character as a watered down version of their main character and not getting a lot of the benefit around switching to begin with. So it's also a good way to test your muscle memory as a general thing. If I turn off my thinking more or less completely at this point, especially for people who play characters like Colleen, Bison, Ryu, who have to parry a bunch of things, he does have a few things there to just throw you off guard, frustrate you a little bit. He can empty jump at particular spaces, will get out of the way of other things. So while my Colleen combos are probably terrible, I play Colleen much more defensively than most people do, not than Chun-Li. But that's almost exactly what I'm talking about. My Colleen is defensive because my Chun-Li is defensive, not because it's a specific thing I always want to do. It's just that obviously she's really good at that, so I like it. So I can continue to win games by keeping my focus in certain things, playing Colleen this way. Everything works out more or less alright. But I'm not going to be good at Colleen. I'm not going to be able to face someone who beats my Chun-Li and then say, I need to do this now because Colleen is the better way to deal with you, and still necessarily manage to win. I might manage to counter the thing they're doing that's bothering me, but it's much less likely that I'm going to win simply because I can't do everything. There's one example. I'm aware mentally that Colleen's air throw and Chun-Li's air throw are not quite the same range, and one is more susceptible to being damaged than the other. But I'm not necessarily going to remember that in a match where my opponent suddenly starts jumping in a lot and my better option is to do that. They're the same when I'm reacting from close, but they're not the same when I'm reacting from far. There's a specific range at which the two diverge, and until I learn it, I won't really be able to do that much here. That combo is the one that I have the most luck with because I know how to do that specifically well. But there's a bunch of stuff that I'm not doing correctly here. For example, I really need to grind that. But there's nothing like that in Chun-Li's repertoire, so it just doesn't click to me that this should happen. I can get myself to crouch and hit the heavy kick, that's easy. But can I get myself to recognize this is a cancelable move and cancel it correctly when I'm normally used to canceling from mediums into stuff? This sort of thing is the secondary purpose of the NashBot, and the points are just there to help you recognize that you should have a specific focus, and keeping that focus in mind relative to the bot and your own characters is probably the best way to manage a lot of things. It's also particularly good for people who use throw on defense a lot, because Nash is, again, a character who tends to move himself away after hitting you, such that you can only use that for certain things. So if you find that you're dropping a lot of combos, if you find that you can't keep track of your opponent and keep your autopilot going at the same time, this bot was designed almost specifically for you and that situation. I may even end up showing off this bot if I ever decide I'm going to be serious about Zeku, or just to test and show off what Zeku plays like, get some ideas about him. Because, as you learn quickly, the AI does not necessarily do what you want. It's easy to see if you are playing against the same opponent over and over. But while a bot does specifically showcase that, most of our bots are not this comprehensive because their tools are more specific, or they aren't that well designed overall in terms of tools. The characters' tools are not designed to overlap with each other as much as Nash's are. This is fine for a player. In fact, that can make a character very good from the player's perspective in certain ways, but it doesn't make for a good CPU or bot. If you've ever tried to fight CPU Zangief, you recognize very quickly that Zangief doesn't really have a lot of overlap in what his moves are supposed to do. They're just there. So you can take one approach against him all the time, whereas a player is very likely to get more creative. And our goal here was to give a bot that effectively mimics that player creativity, even if it has to put in a little extra randomness and put itself at risk. But since it's a punished bot, as usual, you're going to spend most of your time on defense and recognizing that, as well as building up the bot's V trigger and therefore letting it use the V trigger to get behind you. It has a stronger tendency to do pretty much nothing once it gets there, but it's not really incapable. It's just weird about when it does certain things. So I need to, for example, build up an entire defensive instinct overdoing crouched light punch into her whole target combo. But I don't usually have time in matches to think about that enough to build it up. This bot is here to help me learn to do that. I can grind that, but then there will always be that moment where I'm a little too far out or the opponent moves at the wrong timing and I do the wrong thing as a result of this. Note, and it will be noted on the base as well, that move is actually still plus. However, we did not necessarily make sure that he could always do something good after it. So just don't go like defending against moonsault badly. However, you could always switch back to the CPU and it will quickly remind you why you shouldn't do certain things. For example, I would have countered there, for sure. Even though the throw was the thing that ended up happening. And a real Nash is much more likely to throw. But the CPU wouldn't have made me hesitate to think about it because I would eventually recognize and think to myself, oh, this doesn't even work, so it doesn't matter. Moving in on him also has similar effects. If you try to get close to him, certain things will happen as a result of you doing that. And you have to think heavily about the spacings that you do things from, just to make sure that you don't end up getting clipped by him. Because eventually the bot will get you into a defensive position where you'll keep on thinking it's time to do other things. But this is not necessarily even going to work. I really should rewire my thinking to make myself think of her as Guy and make this work. But there's a moment, for example. I'm used to going crouch light punch, stand light punch, into target combo. But there is a range at which this doesn't work. And if I just get used to always hitting it, then that sort of thing will happen to me. If I mess up the timing because I hesitate thinking that I might not be able to hit it, the same thing happens. The opponent doesn't necessarily beat me as a result of that, but they do cause me more trouble than if they didn't. You're also supposed to try to avoid getting crossed up by Nash. But those are the main things that are covered here. In terms of learning a new character and why he can be useful for that, I will obviously switch once again. Now, if I say a new character altogether, this is probably the only new-ish character I have any interest in. I was a Vega player before, not as a main, but tertiary? Let's call it tertiary. But the way that Vega play has changed in this game, I consider it a very positive change even though it made me drop him. There's a lot of stuff that he gained and he didn't really lose that much, it's just that he lost very specific things that I spend a lot of time using. So, what do I know about fighting with Vega? Pretty much nothing at this point. I don't think I've seriously touched this character even once. But I know that I should hit certain buttons in certain spaces because that's what I've seen other people do. But this is now an unfamiliar feeling, as it should be. It's a new character. It would probably make more sense to grind at least a couple of combos. But Vega's not really so much a combo character in the first place. Do you know the times that I'm going to land the heavy kick crash counter and get everything you're supposed to get off it? I wouldn't really even bother myself. It doesn't hit crouchers, blah blah, so on. And you could spend a lot of time learning that heavy kick crash counter and all the cool, huge combos it causes if your opponents are going to be like Ken, Ryu, and people you expect to Shoryuken. But what do I do here? This is not a matchup I'm familiar enough with to say I know when to hit the heavy kick to actually get that combo. So now, if I did learn a cool crush counter combo for Vega using the stand heavy kick, I face the bot and recognize I don't even know when to use this. And the same thing can happen in a real match against a person when you're playing a new character if you spent a lot of time learning main combos. So yeah, when do I use this thing? Even his bat dash doesn't seem to get caught by it. This is not actually true. Nash's bat dash should get caught by it most of the time, I think. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe I've just learned that this doesn't actually work this way. And then the one time it did work just now, I wasn't ready for it to do any combo. I should note that I don't actually know the combo, and therefore nothing would have happened regardless. But I have no idea what I'm doing. But knowing the heavy punch wouldn't mean that the heavy kick combo wouldn't mean I would actually know what I was doing. I would just fish for it and eventually get frustrated. So I'll treat him as a poking character instead, because that's how I would normally play such a character. It's the reason I played him before. So that seems easy enough. I can just do this and this and this. And it's fairly easy to get NashBot beaten up because, as I said, he hits a lot of buttons. But if you start trying to space yourself instead to hit with the tip of such things, you find suddenly that getting space isn't all that easy relatively. And when you do get it, it seems as if it's almost too much because of how his jump arc works. So The bot is necessary to help you learn the limitations of a new character, what's whiff punishable and so on. After you've learned a couple combos, and you know that you want to try to use these combos in particular spacings, you can learn when you can't do it. Here's my favorite Vega move, wall dive stuff. But now I have to track a Nash that doesn't stay still long enough for me to even do the wall dive stuff. And then I get hit. Okay, wait. I'll just do this instead. No, that didn't work either. And I'll note, I was a Vega player before, and I know they didn't change that much. So, why am I missing? Oh, there we go, that's better. But he was really quiet at that moment. Maybe I wasn't actually missing because of being out of practice, and maybe I was missing because Nash has movement that can avoid that move. More importantly, when can I get my command throw off? Especially once I've lost the claw. That was simple. That was a heavy punch one? Great. That's good to know. Well, obviously I can't do it there. He's close though, so I should be able to do it from this. It's one thing to learn on a single target that is not moving, when can I hit my move? But that surprised me. So he does overhead and I go for command throw and I whiff. This is interesting and useful information. Does it whiff if I use the light punch one? Probably not. But I don't know that, and I'm going to have to keep fighting him until I know that, because that is the purpose. And if I walk out of that, then I also cause myself to whiff, even with the light punch one. At this point, I'm going to start turning on the inputs as promised, and quickly recap what the actual inputs are, but I'll more so likely do that toward the end of the stream. But for now, sure I could do big jump-in combos, but can I punish him properly? That was a counter hit, so that was not a punish, but obviously that was crouch medium kick, so it shouldn't be. Oh wait, I'm not supposed to hit that button. And now I'm getting overhead. But he's out of the way again. And because of the time he spends in the air, any combos you were used to for hitting on the ground, now you have to worry about what happens when you collide with him in the air and he ends up in the wrong place. The easy thought, okay, I'll stop doing that, I'll go for the throw instead. Sounds much easier. But the problem is that his throw isn't that easy. You have to have a fairly good idea of when your opponent is going to go into the air or not. And I'm mostly catching him because he's moving forward or jumping at the time. I can still miss completely, and while I don't get punished a lot for it, I certainly have to learn different things than I thought I did. Obviously, I don't intend to go through too much of Vega because there could be another bot that I need to do similar things for, and it helps to have a character I'm interested in but have basically nothing I can actually do with. You'll also learn things like that, where you hit the opponent away with a certain move, which is also important for ranges. And yet again I miss. This is actually a Vega weakness as well, freaking out when you've missed an attack. It's very common at the lower levels for Vega players. And like most bots, as you can see, he adapts his rhythm somewhat based on the character that is fighting him. But it's one thing to practice a combo that you expect will always work. And another thing entirely to have to adapt on the fly to an enemy that's moving around and still land your same combo. Even whether or not he's in the air at the beginning of a particular thing will affect how dangerous he can be. So you can use this information to help you figure out whether or not you're comfortable enough with a character to take them into real matches. Rather than just going, well, I know some combos, so let me try this one out. Especially if you don't necessarily have a lot of good opponents for the day. And you've already gotten through everything you can learn from, let's say, CPU level 8 Nash. Because CPU level 8 Nash versus Vega is a very boring thing as far as I'm concerned. You learn how to do that, you learn how to get out of those, and then you learn how to specifically space yourself. But look, technically this is easier to hit, at least for me, than the bot is. He can duck under things, but he does that based on the opponent CPU effectively reading your inputs more so than anything else. Or he'll always perfect counter with that, which you could just mess with. You never know exactly what a CPU will have a blind spot to or just flatly fail at. And it doesn't always teach you much. On the other hand, you tend to lose a lot more health like that, then don't get anywhere from it. So as mentioned, I am going to go back to Chun-Li and show off a couple more things, and of course review the current inputs, even though you can get the inputs at 2-mk.org on Sunday when we release the bot officially, and they're unlikely to have changed given the purpose of the bot. Still, if you want to get a head start on it, I'll review them. As well as some of the purposes and a couple of things that you might be able to be creative with and vary stuff around for yourself.
Chun-Li.
The main thing to understand, other than what has already been mentioned, is that this bot is very tailorable to a specific aim using the last action. And in order to demonstrate that, I'm going to turn off action 5 entirely. because this is almost a valid version of the bot in itself. He still will jump, he will still do certain things. In fact, the only thing he loses really is 1 or 2 heavy punch hits and a tragedy assault. He moves a lot less and moves a lot slower. But depending on your fighting styles, that might be more difficult for you to deal with. So the bot might in fact be outright more useful to you with Action 5 off. He's also decent with Action 5 changed. And that can be important as well. I hope I'm not going to have to make people actually try to get that jab in there. It's really useful, but... well, that's why perfect inputs are a thing. Also, it helps those of you who spend a lot of time getting pressure off of hard knockdowns and similar throw things to have to deal with a bot that back rolls more than most do. But I can already see there are certain flaws in my autopilot sequences. And some combos that I'm able to drop. Basically, Chun-Li's Rangyaku is not a move that you're supposed to use for most things, but it's an interestingly good whiff punish when your opponent is sticking out buttons to keep you out of a particular space and to prevent you from throwing out your own. But I'm also finding that I have the tendency to hit it when I expect that to happen and they jump instead, which can be good depending on the opponent, but certainly isn't good enough of the time that it should be my autopilot response. I should be able to recognize the spacing at which is a good idea to hit that button. You can also use it to practice some of your harder combos because he's the sort of character who isn't going to punish you too heavily for dropping them, but every time you drop them it will be really blatant that you did, because then you'll have to defend in particular ways and he'll get away from you in similar things. So once again, please note that this is actually the bot without the last action. If I decided to put something else in here that I am not familiar with on Nash, that I think would be good against my character particularly, or if I just want to experiment with bots as a general thing and I don't know how to start, most of NashBot's inputs are easy enough that even a beginner who is not used to the concept of bots can easily mess with what they want it to do and throw in sequences and a bunch of other things. If you want to do V-trigger more, sure. If you want to do V-trigger in different directions, do that. If you want long sonic boom loops or things that keep him at a range that you can't deal with well, put in an extra backdash. It is so easy to restore the initial input that you don't even have to worry about messing it up. And while you might be able to negatively affect the bot's rhythm, if you've put in the initial version, or even just gotten used to fighting it without that, you can easily see the differences in rhythm that occur by you adding them. This is also one of the best spots to use when you are streaming. If you happen to stream and have training mode on, because Again, the goal is to have a bot against whom you can autopilot, but who actually puts up a fight, and maybe someone on your stream helping you can tell you, you know what, I've been watching you fight this thing while you talk, and you keep on doing this thing that's wrong, you should do this thing instead. You never know who will be able to help you. But most of our other bots will never get you there because they'll have to spend too much time figuring out what exactly is happening. But with that said, we'll give the inputs again. This time I will go from 5 to 1 and count down, however. Just to show off the fact that they get increasingly difficult the other way. You might even want to input them that way because it's simpler. As always, these will be up on the site, but the versions that are up on the site are very short and they don't always show you even what it's meant to be, only to make sure that your actual key inputs are close to correct. You may not be able to use them to figure out what is supposed to happen, and this video might therefore be a good reference for that. And for this I'm going to turn my health back on just so that we don't have to go through these intermediate loading. So at this point, it's literally just crouch heavy punch, a forward jump, and a shoryuken motion. It is possible, based on some interactions, to do Sonic Boom, especially if you're the sort of person who doesn't input your shoryukens ending perfectly at down forward. If you play a lot of charge characters, or characters who have command normals that involve down forward, you're usually trying to avoid hitting that direction without meaning to, or staying there for too long. You can poke at him occasionally just to see how his rhythm changes. But yes, crouch heavy punch, you should aim to hit the heavy punch early in, but unlike many bots where it must be first frame, he's actually fairly lenient about it. One other thing he has is that if you have the timing for the jump correct, he does different things, but you could always, as I said, change the timing. My version of it will eventually land and then start doing it. Your version might jump and hit the heavy punch progressively later into the jump until finally the heavy punch is hitting you, whereas it might not start off by doing that. There are all sorts of ways. Action 4 is a relatively complex thing that is intended to give him his knee bullet and a target combo. We gave him the most basic of his target combos. There is a specific set of inputs that effectively allows him to do a different target combo, but you'd have to get hit with that one in a particular way, and it gets complicated to actually make it happen for sure. However, it's not that meaningful. I mean, as mentioned before, bots doing more damage to you isn't necessarily a high priority thing. They're just supposed to do enough to make you nervous in some way. This input should be kept almost exactly as it is, but it's fairly easy to input because you can basically mash out the end. The target combo, however, will only work if you can hit the medium kick. You can hit medium kick, heavy kick all the times, but you'd have to plink it if you do this. But as you can see, I just mashed it mostly, a ton, and didn't even get them all close together. It's not really that relevant though. Mashing after, during the forward jump, also not really a problem, in fact possibly better. Most of the time he doesn't do anything except the light kick again when he jumps again. And once again, rhythm changes here. Depending on what you block out of that, he will do different jumping timings, different buttons, different spacings. And you have to learn to deal with all of those. Action 3 is relatively simple to deal with. That is where his overhead comes from. Again, it doesn't have to be first frame. It technically doesn't have to be medium punch plus light punch. However, triple punch will not work, so since you can't really set a button anyway, you might as well get used to it. But if you don't really need him to be able to do EX Tragedy Assault or EX Sonic Boom, which is perfectly valid as a method, especially if you have some other plans for Action 5, you could just do it with a regular medium punch. You could also do the regular medium punch later and not actually the B skill. This is just the version that we find the most interesting because different characters have different needs from him. As you can see, if you delay certain things enough, you can cause strange behaviors from him. And that was why that is set up like that. If you neutral jump over his fireball, there is a timing in which he can moonsault instead, because the fireball will not leave the screen early enough, and it will read the inputs extremely leniently if you were very fast and result in moonsault. I don't think I can recreate this on demand though. There we go. So presumably it's like a full screen thing. This isn't necessarily useful because the moonsault he does doesn't reach. But if you're the sort of person who does other methods to get under fireballs or get through them, for example, Cammy turn knuckle, you just get around it and figure you've solved the problem. The fireball's still on the screen, which prevents him from being able to do anything else, and that is where the moonsault comes in. I can't necessarily replicate the timing easily enough to say this should work this way, but you can figure it out yourself. It's probably not necessarily worth pushing that to get in a particular way to help everyone, but some people have uses for it. Balrog in particular, Vega to some extent. People with projectile invincible moves, especially moves that move them forward and causes the projectile to pass through them, you can find some decent tricks that come out of that. Ashen 2 is relatively simple to input but shouldn't be removed because he really needs the throw, and it helps if you fight Nashes and you get used to this heavy punch. This heavy punch never stops being used. At high levels it is still useful. And as you can see, he moves out of the way really well. So there's not a lot that most people can do. As mentioned, Chun-Li can just... But Chun-Li can punish nearly anything from anywhere. As long as you're within like half a screen and you're -5, she can do something about it. As you can see, he will cancel that into V-trigger when he has V-trigger, which is also useful in many ways, but not as heavily useful as it would seem given that he then goes into basic stuff. If you combine that with Action 4, however, you can at least get some interesting things happening. The other reason this one is necessary is because it gives him his sweep. And depending on the rhythm and the timing of the bot, he can end up doing dash in sweep, which is a thing that Nash actually does fairly often at the not mid levels, the bronze levels. You can see that often enough that you care. So I'm going to beat him up a little bit just to demonstrate what this is supposed to do. I'd rather not give him full V-meter, I'll just throw out some combos on him or something. But as he has that tendency, you'd have to wait a little while to make sure that you actually get hit by something. Because as you'll note, it's only when he actually hits you that he cancels the V. And that can be a good test for you to make sure that the input is correct, because he doesn't always do it. But again, see, he doesn't always do it. There's a specific timing, if you've done it correctly, where he cancels from that. I believe that he is able to cancel from it on any hit, but he cancels more easily if it's crash countered. But still, it's just a standard throw into a forward heavy punch that technically also acts as a dash. If your version doesn't act as a dash, don't worry about it, it's not usually a problem. It's good to have it, but it doesn't really matter too much. So this is imperfect on my side, but I never really noticed because the dashes were working fine. Probably more necessary than that because he will... Most people do need him to dash in more, but you can see how easy it is to change the rhythm of a bot entirely this way. But after that, just down bat plus V skill, and if you want a different... Sorry, down bat plus V trigger, and if you want a different V trigger, I suggest you don't put it in on this one. Because the left-right mix-up is distracting enough and meaningful enough to mess with our autopilot, and therefore get some use out of that. And of course, the initial action 1, which is the most complicated. The crouching medium kick, light kick. This is probably not required to be first frame either. I believe I've tested with some inputs that were not the first frame version. But it might make a difference eventually. Followed by an immediate crouching medium punch, a dash forward, standing medium punch, and then the quarter circle back, and using whatever button ends your recording as if it were the attack button to do that move, and you get whatever you need to. This particular input is good for teaching you how to not do certain things in terms of your own bad habits and change the flows of your matches. It's also the one most likely to cause the bot to repeat certain actions and therefore cause the player to have to think about what that means. Also his main source of anti-airs, but that's not as relevant. We didn't give him heavy kick, scythe, but you could do that. You could simply change the number 5 input to start with a heavy kick of some kind instead, and he'd gain that move. If you had some reason to do it and couldn't just rely on the EX one. So as usual, I'll try not to have this guidance go on too long. It's usually a lot of information to take in. And probably better if it doesn't stretch out beyond the 90 minutes we normally use for our streams. So, as always, look out for the bot on Sunday around 6 Eastern Time at our site 2-mk.org, where it will be joining as one of our easy bots. And while it is not quite as focused as Birdie in terms of making sure that you have done everything, that you have yourself prepared for all the reactions you need, it's just below that. It's the point where you have reactions, but you need to make sure that they're all in place. But the bot can't be considered much more than easy at this point, even given what it does.